Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Entertainment Network. I am your host, Sarah. Happy New Year. I am so happy to be with you incredibly late for this episode, but happy to be with you for this episode. Before we get into all of that, as we get started, I do want to ask you, as always, to please like, follow, subscribe on whatever platform you are either listening to or watching this episode on. Really does help the algorithm and it's greatly appreciated. Also, if you want to help the podcast in a monetary fashion, you can do so by going to gsmcpodcast.info. You see that information playing in the video next to me. It's also going to be scrolling along at the bottom of the episode throughout the episode. Again, that's gsmcpodcast.info. You can help the podcast and the entire network in a monetary fashion. As I said, if you want to also leave a question or a comment while you're at the website, you can do that. That's great. I love to hear from people and I'm happy to engage with those questions at the beginning of the episode following receiving said comments and or questions. How is your 2025 going? It is crazy to even say that. But how is your 2025 going so far? This episode should have been my very last episode of 2024. It should have aired on Tuesday, New Year's Eve. But this week has been a little crazy. So I have had a migraine off and on all week. My husband has also been sick. We got food poisoning and we got a new puppy. Was that bad timing? Yes, it was. Was it the planned timing? No, it wasn't. I keep saying we accidentally adopted a puppy, but that's not exactly true. We didn't accidentally adopt a puppy. We adopted a puppy with intention. It's just that the timing was a little bit different than we originally anticipated. At any rate, we have a 9-week-old puppy. He's adorable. Our older dog, who you often see running around in the video behind me, and who has been very, very sad since his sister died in September. He has perked up. He is much livelier than he was before the puppy came home, but he's also terrified of the 2-pound puppy. It's another Chihuahua, a tiny little Chihuahua, 2 pounds, maybe 3, somewhere between 2 and 3. And our Chihuahua, who's always seemed so tiny to me, now seems huge, but he just runs away from the puppy. Like, he's always thought that he was a big dog. He could take any other dog until confronted with this 2-pound menace that has come to live in his house. And the baby just wants to play. So we'll see how this plays out. Chalupa is starting to relax a little bit, and I'm hoping that that's going to continue and that they will get to know each other and like each other and enjoy each other. We'll see. I'll keep you updated. Let's talk about a book. This is the first book in a trilogy, urban fantasy. The author is Evette Davis. The book is The Others. Let me bring that up, and then I'll give you the description of the book. It's described as True Blood meets Supernatural in this the kickoff of this urban paranormal fantasy series from author Evette Davis. Readers enter a dystopian San Francisco filled with empaths and vampires embroiled in political unrest. Much as she wishes otherwise, superstar political consultant Olivia Shepherd was born a powerful empath. It's a legacy she walked away from long ago, but when she wakes up one morning to find Elsa, a tenacious time walker, standing in her kitchen, she realizes she can no longer ignore her gifts. She is quickly plunged into the hidden world of powerful others and drafted to work for the Council, a shadowy organization that summons the fog to San Francisco to obscure their involvement in human affairs. Complicating matters further is Olivia's new love interest, William. A centuries-old vampire, William is far too jaded to take an interest in human affairs, but Olivia no longer has the luxury of remaining impartial. As shocking details from Olivia's own past emerge and her role in the council begins to take shape, will she rise to the challenge of her destiny? So again, that is the description of The Others. It is book 1 in the Council Trilogy. We have two more books to look forward. If you're a fan of urban fantasy, then you definitely want to check this out. I love that it's urban fantasy that takes place in San Francisco, which is one of my favorite places, the Bay Area as a whole, one of my favorite places. And I like the way Evette takes some of the tropes that we're used to in terms of fantasy. For instance, Olivia does know that she is an empath. She does know that she has these gifts, but she has been actively ignoring them, repressing them, not wanting to use them until she's, of course, thrown into this situation. Elsa shows up in her kitchen, and now she has to use them, and she finds out all kinds of things. So that's your pretty typical trope of someone who maybe doesn't know they have powers, or they're thrust into a situation that they're not expecting. But Olivia is not a teenager, and I am not dissing any tropes. You know me, I love fantasy, I love urban fantasy, not dissing any tropes, but it's kind of fun to have an adult heroine. She is, she owns her own business, she has an active career, and she does know that she is an empath. She's again just been ignoring it, but she's then thrown into this situation. She doesn't know that this entire other world exists. Vampires, fairies, time walkers, everything you can imagine, and so she is thrust into a world that she's not ready for. But Evette does a good job, I think, of taking some of those tropes that we are used to in fantasy and urban fantasy and either tweaking them a little bit or turning them on their heads. We're going to talk a little bit about that in the interview. So I appreciate that. Love the setting. Love that this is a new series, a new trilogy that I can get to know the characters of and get to know a new world in the Bay Area. Although the first one takes place in the Bay Area, the next book's going to be in Europe in different parts. This one, they end up in Paris. Can't complain about that, right? San Francisco to Paris. Good locations, right? At any rate, urban fantasy. Let's let Evette talk about the book. Again, it is The Others. It's the first book in the Council Trilogy. The author is Evette Davis. Let's go to that interview. Hi, Evette, and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm so glad to be here.
I'm excited to have you here. We're going to talk about the first book in your trilogy. It's called The Others. But before we do that, if you wouldn't mind taking just a few minutes to introduce yourself so my listeners can get to know you a bit.
Sure, I'd love to. So my name is Evette Davis, and I split my time between San Francisco and Sun Valley, Idaho. I've been married for almost 30 years, and I have a daughter who is a sophomore at University of Oregon. And this is my fifth novel that I've been working on, and I'm not a writer. My writing is not my day job. I also manage a successful public relations firm in San Francisco. So I do that, and I do this.
Okay, wonderful. And can you explain what's happening behind you? There is
it's a flock of ravens or swallows. This is my daughter's bedroom. She's not here. She's off on a trip with some friends. So I'm hiding out in the bedroom of my guest house. And I thought the flock of birds was ominous enough that it might be a good backdrop for us to have a discussion about supernatural beings. So, and that's my husband's snowboard with somebody who I think looks slightly ominous too. So I thought the whole thing just worked out well for me.
Yeah, it's visually interesting. I don't often get extra guests in the background, so
that's great. Well, think of it as sort of like a Hitchcockian kind of intro to the whole thing.
Yeah, perfect. Well, as you've mentioned, I've mentioned the book is The Others. It's the first in a trilogy. It's urban fantasy. So if you can give an overview of the story.
Well, in a nutshell, The Others is about a secret society of witches and vampires that interfere in politics to try to save humanity.
That is the elevator pitch.
Yeah. Right. So it's an urban fantasy. It's set in current times. The headquarters of The Others is in San Francisco. It's also, I think, a kind of celebration of San Francisco as a magical city, which is also somewhat timely in the sense that our city has a little bit of a bad rap right now. But it's also a meditation finally on women and how they derive their power and how they maintain it. And because I think that is apropos of our last election, there is still this very open question about women and, whether they get to be in charge and how can they be leaders successfully and appeal to people. And I think we're still having that conversation to be, friends.
Going to be having that conversation for a long time. So
I think so.
Yeah. I love that it's in San Francisco and how very quickly in the book you're talking about San Francisco as, it makes sense to have this urban fantasy here because San Francisco has all these different little pockets. I've lived in the Bay Area and can absolutely picture urban fantasy taking place in San Francisco. So in some ways it's another character. Can you talk a little bit about San Francisco as that character?
Sure. Well, so I was born in Los Angeles and raised there, and I came to Northern California by my own choice to go to college. But I remember the very first time I went to San Francisco, I went to stay with a friend and he drove us across the Bay Bridge. And I don't know, it was like a portal opened up in my mind. And I was in this place that was just so very different. You know, I had grown up in this vast suburban kind of area with freeways and cars and big parking lots. And here was this jewel box that immediately comes down to your view. And I just fell in love with it. And I just said by hook or by crook, I was gonna end up there. And it took me a few years. I went to Mills College, which is a private women's college in Oakland. And I stayed in the Bay Area for a while as a newspaper journalist, and then left and came back with my husband and moved into San Francisco. And that was like in the late 90s. And I just began to really discover the true beauty of that city. It's its architecture, it's the scale of it, the way you can be walking in these tiny alleys and then you turn down and hear something else you've never seen, or it's the lanterns hanging in Chinatown. And if you look at my Instagram, you'll see that I often, stop to take pictures of murals or lights or interesting bars or signs. And there are certainly other cities, Lisbon, for example, in Portugal, that have that kind of quality of the narrowness that allows you to really be in there. And so for me, San Francisco, it made sense to put the others headquartered in this museum there. And it has this enormous observation tower that looms up out of the sky. And from it, you can see the entire Bay Area and Mount Tam and the Golden Gate Bridge. So a lot of people didn't like that. So I decided, well, we'll just make that like ground zero for these people.
You mentioned Lisbon, and in a lot of ways, Portugal reminds me of California, and Lisbon reminds me a lot of San Francisco. So
absolutely. I will send you a video when I'm done that I took of a trolley car going down the hill in Lisbon, and a picture overlooking what is your Bay Bridge there. And anyway, it's very similar. So
yeah, well, same architect did the Golden Gate Bridge and the bridge in Lisbon. So, and speaking of the Golden Gate, it kind of gets all the press, all the notoriety, but there's something about driving across the Bay Bridge going into San Francisco that's
right.
Just like you were saying, it does feel like you're going into another world.
You have Treasure Island and the trees and the redwoods and the shore, and then all of a sudden the skyline rises up, and then you have the ferry building in Quake Tower. It is quite spectacular.
It is.
I'm going to tell SF Travel, everybody come visit San Francisco.
I agree. We could have a total love letter to San Francisco for the entire episode, but we should probably talk about the book more.
Absolutely.
I do love that this first book takes place in San Francisco, that it's a little bit, there is a little bit of it being another character, and we could have definitely had a whole love letter to San Francisco in our conversation. I'm also noticing as I look at the recording as it's playing that you cannot see the snowboard that she's referencing. It was behind her, but it's been cut off in the cropped version of this, but it was a snowboard. There was a face on it. It was, kind of blurred out behind her with the background being blurred, and it wasn't spooky or anything, but I liked the vibe, and you can't see it. So there was a snowboard back there, but snowboard, love San Francisco. Time to take our first break. When we come back, we'll be talking about the inspiration for the story, what Evette took as her jumping off point for this story and the trilogy. You're tuned in to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my conversation with author Evette Davis. This is your second and final reminder to please, if you would like to help the podcast in another way, go to gsmcpodcast.info. There you can leave a tip or a donation, a question or a comment, and really help out the algorithm and help us out not only this podcast, but the network as a whole. As I said, I'm happy to engage with questions and comments. And again, if you want to help the podcast in a monetary fashion, that's gsmcpodcast.info. As always, every bit of support you give, no matter what form that support takes, is always greatly appreciated. We were talking about San Francisco before the break. It's the setting of The Others, which is the first book in this trilogy that we are speaking of. And we were just talking about how we both love the city, and I really think it's one of the perfect settings for urban fantasy, but that's what we were talking about before the break. Let's go ahead and return to the conversation with Evette.
So was San Francisco your inspiration for the story, or what was your jumping off point?
You know, the inspiration for the story was my experiences as a public relations woman at a time when the industry was mostly men, and just the frustration of how do you navigate being in power. You know, it's like when you give someone an answer in a room and somebody else gives that same answer, like a man, and it's like brilliant and you're still waiting there. And so the book began as a play. I had read all these plays about ancient female warriors, you know, who had thwarted the Romans and all sorts of things. And I was going to write a play about a political consultant who's like having trouble, and out of the corner of her eye, she sees this ancient female warrior. It's like, take his head off. What are you waiting for? You know, like, get tough. But I was a terrible playwright. And so it ended up ultimately morphing into this series. And these books were self-published a few years ago. And then I have a new publisher who wanted to take the trilogy and the third book, which had never been written, and to sort of revive them and modernize them. And so what we're getting actually is a new and more thoughtful version of this journey in the 2020s. And so, yeah, it's a meditation on women and how they gain their power. And I don't want to give any spoilers away, but the main heroine in the book is this woman named Olivia, who's a political consultant who wakes up one day and finds a time walker sitting in her kitchen who's been sent by her family to sort of help her discover her powers. And it takes her on a journey of self-discovery that I think most women can relate to, which is, can I really do that? Oh, I can do that. Well, okay, if I can do that, what else can I do? And I can do those things, and I can also do other things. And you know, in general, women are kind of quite evolutionary in sorry to the other sex, but like we're daughters, we're mothers, we're partners, we're working women, we're right. So we just do so many things in one skin, much more than I think people realize, women especially. So that's what the journey is about. And
I like that, you know, that with urban fantasy, with fantasy of any kind, you can make metaphors, you can make allegories, you can do all these things. And so there are literal demons. You know, she doesn't know it in the beginning when we meet her, but a lot of things that are happening to her are because there is an actual demon.
That's right.
Influencing her life.
So, yeah. And I mean, it's sometimes, you know, I look back at the name of the time walker, her name is Elsa. And, and I wrote that entire novel. And then I look back later and realized that woman was somebody I knew who had helped me in my life. And I had never put two and two together. So, I mean, I think some things are intentional and some things aren't, but I was inspired. So fantasy to me for many years was Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. And, and I grew up watching Star Trek religiously. And then I read The Discovery of Witches by Deborah Harkness. And I actually have just been binge watching the 3 seasons on Netflix right now. But I was so struck by the modernity of those stories of a vampire studying genetics and a witch studying, alchemy at Oxford. And I thought, oh, of course you can do these things. And it really freed me up because I am not a world builder in that kind of, Hobbit sort of way. And so that was a much easier jump for me to create all of that in a contemporary setting.
Yeah. I would imagine then, that's what draws you more to urban fantasy as opposed to high fantasy, because the world exists in urban fantasy. You don't have to recreate it.
Right. And you can surprise people with it.
Yeah.
A baseball player who's a vampire, or, riding the public subway, and, they're everywhere. And you don't know if what you're seeing is what you're seeing. And I like that, not to unsettle people, but it's a good way to check your instincts.
Yeah. And there is world building to an extent because you have to create the framework in which, the normal people, whatever we refer to them in the world, and then the others, as the title suggests. So did you rely on existing lore about, there's vampires, there's witches, or did you kind of create your own? How did you go about that process?
It's a little of both. So I read a lot of different encyclopedias and compendiums about all of these different creatures. And in fact, I wrote an article for Writer's Digest about my writer's library and all the different tools that I use. But I also knew that there are a lot of tropes about vampires that I don't like, the kind of like what we do in the shadows, sort of everybody is wearing Victorian England clothing and they all wear capes and they're always like, bloodthirsty, like frothing people. I thought it'd be interesting if the vampires were the grownups in this story. They're the ones who have the perspective after living a long time. I gave mine the ability to drink and eat lightly. They drink Jack Daniels. That's their drink of choice. So there's a little bit of me changing them, and there's a little bit of the hewing to the traditional trope, because I think you need to take readers along. Readers will for sure bend, right? You'll suspend your imagination or bend it, but you can't go too far and then make it just completely out of the genre. So I pushed them a little bit, but I kept them mostly traditional. So the inspiration was a little bit grounded in Dracula, which is like a book I've read probably, a dozen times. And it's also my own thinking on it and what I wanted them to do. In particular, one of them is a Jew who's a Holocaust, a member of the resistance who is killed by the Nazis and reborn a vampire in the fields of Germany. And I just don't think that anybody's ever thought about that before. Yeah. So I wanted to put people in different places than you would expect.
Yeah. Something you said, I didn't think about it as I read, but when you said it out loud, they drink Jack Daniels. I love the play on words because, they're vampires. They drink blood. Humans drink. Yeah. Yeah. So, it's nicely done. Yeah. Can we talk a little bit more about Olivia as the main character? What's going to resonate with readers?
Well, I sometimes talk about her as being like an unreliable narrator. And I've had actual, readers who I don't like Olivia. Like she, irritates me and pisses me off. And of course she does. She's learning on the go and she's impetuous and impulsive and she gets angry and she's vengeful. And so I think, I think a lot of women relate to her, and they also, as human beings, you relate to somebody who doesn't always handle something well. And I think a lot of people enjoy her journey. She's growing as a person, and she's also taking in a lot of information, and she's trying to process it. And so you have to go through the whole entire trilogy. By the end, I promise you, she's a much different and much better person. But in the first book, she's a little bit of a hot mess. She's falling in love for the first time. She's getting a better handle on her roots. And she's also doing something that she hasn't done, which is she's getting in touch with her feelings and her emotions. And she's sort of put those at bay. And she's been a very logical person. And now she's realizing that without being in touch with her emotions and her intuition, she's really made herself quite vulnerable. And I think a lot of people go through those kinds of experiences of figuring out how they feel and what they want and what they can tolerate. And for some people, it's too much. And for some people, I think it brings them, a sense of calmness and meaning. And so that journey, I think, with a lot of people resonates.
Yeah.
And she's funny and a bit sarcastic, which is the only part of me that I think is in there,
But again, you can do that with fantasy because everything represents something else. So, when we meet Olivia, she's closed off to the gifts that she knows she has, but she just, no, thank you, I'm good. And that so many of us, I think, can resonate with that in terms of, yeah, I know that this is possible, but right. I'm good, thanks. Let's just leave that over there and ignore it. Right. But when we meet her, things are not good. So she's got to confront, hence Elsa showing up in her kitchen.
That's right. Yeah, she's got a competitor who turns out to be a little bit more than she bargained for. He's made a deal with the demon to rise to power, and he's tormenting her. And she has to learn how to stand up for herself and get in touch with her feelings. I also think that every one of us has had a moment where we had an instinct like, maybe we shouldn't do that. Maybe we should, we should turn left instead of right. And we said, oh no, that's silly. And we went ahead and did whatever. And it turned out that our instinct was right. And that's another part of this, is trusting your gut to be a guide for you without the woo-woo. But just, there's a difference between letting the spirits talk to you and actually figuring out that you know a little bit more than you think you know about how to do things.
Yeah.
Okay, so now you can't see the face on the snowboard, so maybe I'm just crazy or losing my mind or confused or whatever. Doesn't matter. You can see it, maybe you can't see it, anyway. We weren't talking about whether or not you could see the face of a snowboard. We were talking about instincts or trusting your gut or trusting that feeling, whatever you call it. We've all had those experiences. hopefully we've trusted them and it's turned out right, or we have, or hopefully you haven't ignored it and things have gone poorly, but we've all had different experiences. We can contemplate those experiences as we go to our next break. When we come back, we'll be talking about character development within the series. You are tuned in to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my conversation with author Evette Davis. Before the break, we were talking about instincts and following those instincts, seeing where those instincts lead you, sometimes having them lead you in ways you maybe weren't expecting, etc. Let's go ahead and return to that conversation.
When it comes to your characters and when you sit down to write a story, do you really like to have a good solid handle on each character before you start writing, or do you prefer to let them kind of develop on their own or somewhere in the middle?
I do a lot of character development. I've had, I've torn pictures out of magazines or newspapers back in the olden days before we could just do it all online. I've kept binders. I write pretty deep character, kinds of bios and profiles. But having said that, especially if you're going to take somebody through 3 books, they are going to change. And sometimes they're going to tell you things and surprise you, and you have to make room for that. And there's some of that going on in this trilogy where things that I didn't think were going to happen ended up happening in terms of friendships and romances, and I let them. And there's been many times when I've been doing something and I thought, what will Olivia do in this moment? And, it's so sometimes, things change, but the core of them, who they were, how they became who they are, who their parents are, that was all mapped out well in advance. And I keep that by my side because, as you can imagine, as you go from 1 book to 3 books, that's, 900 pages or whatever, like you sometimes have to go back and remind yourself so you tie these ends up properly.
Yes, because readers are going to point
they
things
will, they will spot it.
Yeah.
Totally.
Yes. You mentioned reading and doing some often with fantasy, you don't think of research, but what were there any parts of your reading that surprised you, or, maybe you didn't think about, kind of excited you for the story?
Well, I've definitely done a lot of research. Like, I don't know anything about witchcraft, and I had to figure out how to use, spells and learn about, charms. And I didn't know anything about voodoo. And I've traveled to New Orleans many, many times. There were certain battles in the Civil War. There were certain things about World War II that I had forgotten. So I've actually done a lot of research. And then I also have traveled a lot. Like the second book, which we can talk about when you're ready, is set in Eastern Europe. And I actually made my family travel with me to Serbia and to Belgrade in the winter and stay in an apartment so that I could walk it and, eat in the restaurants and kind of get a feel for it. And part of it's in Croatia. And I had, spent a month touring Croatia and Dubrovnik. So there's definitely a lot of research. It's probably not as much as in another novel I wrote called 48 States, which is about a maniacal CEO tries to overthrow the government.
Mm-hmm.
That one had a lot more research because I didn't, there are a lot of things in the future that I didn't, like a fracking territory, which I didn't know anything about fracking. So it varies, but I don't think you can really write a novel without a little bit of research for certain details.
Sure.
Yeah. And the others, the council, which is the organization that Olivia becomes a part of, I had to find a model for that. And I sort of settled roughly on a combination of like the UN and the World Bank sort of, which I knew something about, having worked in politics and government as a part of my career arc. But so I'd had to go back and do a little bit of reading on that. And I love the idea of making witches and others kind of a slave to their own bureaucracy. There was something sort of funny to me about that, having served on the Hill as a member of a press aide to a member of Congress. Like I just like putting them there and seeing how they would manage it. So
But anytime you put people of differing backgrounds in a room together and make them try to have a governing body, they're going to argue, especially, and just because they're vampires and witches, they're still going to come
Right.
at things from
Right.
completely
And they do. Right. And they do. And you see there's all different kinds of worldviews ultimately as a part of that organization about what their role is and who they should be helping. And I think that's interesting too, right?
Yeah. And this is off topic, but I just was thinking about Lily, who is Olivia's best friend, who also happens to be a fairy, but who also happens to be a librarian. So, as the daughter of a librarian, thanks for.
Well, yeah. And so, one of the questions you ask is what is something that you want to know about me? And I am a huge supporter of public libraries. I've run a number of campaigns to either create or restore permanent funding for library systems, especially in San Francisco. I have a real life best friend who's the head librarian, was in San Francisco. Now she's the head librarian in San Jose. And so, yeah, and there's a librarian in 48 states too, who's the head of the Haley Library. So yeah, I'm a big booster of libraries, and I fundamentally believe in that access to information. I think it's one of the core principles of our democracy. And, I like to visit libraries when I travel abroad and see how they are done. Because, some libraries are like very swanky. They have coffee shops and all sorts of things.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
I agree. You did mention the second book. The first book, I mean, obviously we can't talk about the ending of the first book, but things are revealed as they always are when you're transitioning. So what can you say about the second book without, of course, giving too much away?
Yeah, the way I like to describe it is that the second book is sort of, it's just more, death-defying adventures for Olivia and her brood as she sort of processes what she's learned and then has to go out and deal with more adversity as a result of her affiliation with the council. She comes into contact with people that fundamentally change her life, and now she has to navigate and manage that. And so the stakes just get really high in the second book. It takes place mostly in Eastern Europe, and a little bit in Paris, and it's a little bit more grown up. It's got a little bit more sort of sexiness to it. I think the heat builds as you get into the middle, and there's some surprising new relationships and friendships that develop. So I think it's quite good. And the pace and the kind of the tension, I think, is a little bit tighter and more fast paced. So I think people will like it. It's called The Gift, and I got a note from my publisher of it. It's gone to print. It'll be out in March. And the advanced reader copies are out. So I'll make sure that my publicist sends one to you so you can take a look at it. Yep. And the third book is done. And it's to the editors to take a look at. And that's called The Campaign. That's the third and final book. And it will be released in September of next year. So 2 books in the trilogy out next year, which I feel like that's fun for readers who get hooked, that they don't have to wait, 3 years. And that's one of the benefits, I think, of taking this trilogy which got started and modernizing it. And, when the books were first written, like, people still read newspapers. And I remember when I first got the first, proofread back, and the editor was like, like, newspapers, and there were, Spotify didn't exist. And so there were a lot of ways in which the story had to be brought up. And also, it was surprisingly issues of agency, sexual agency, and past the, post Me Too, just like things that wouldn't have seemed not okay now would be. So it was actually quite fun to look at a book you wrote and be able to improve it and bring it back. So this whole journey has been marvelous. I've just had the best time ever.
There is a little bit of a nod to the fated mates trope within the book. So how did you go about writing it? Because that one can be a little tricky, a little problematic. So for you personally, how did you navigate that particular trope?
Well, I mean, I have kind of a contrarian, streak. Like, fated mates, I just blow it up. And frankly, that's what happens for a little while in the second book, is I just blow it all up. And then you have to figure out how it gets put back together again. And I had a really good time doing that. But at the whole core of this, I mean, this whole issue of like fate, like what's fate and what isn't, and can you control your fate? Yeah. And I introduced tarot cards in the second book, and just this notion of, what happens if you get a glimpse of your future? Can you change it? I mean, I don't know. I'm just having a good time thinking about it. And I like, watching vampires concerned about their fate, because their fate is endless. They've been around for millennia. And so, like, what do they care? 5 minutes is nothing, to people who live forever. I mess around with fated romances and fated mates and things that people assume. And I hope that everybody forgives me and waits and comes back to the end when, all will be revealed.
Well, it's often hard to be a fantasy reader because you can have, it's never one book. Like standalone fantasy is very rare. And then it's often 3 to 20 and you can wait a year between or more between. So the fact that you could read this book, readers out there, you can read that you can be done by the end of 2025 with the entire trilogy, which is awesome.
I know I already said it, but I really do appreciate a trilogy or a series that wraps up in a timely fashion. That, there's one thing to committing a decade, multiple decades to reading a series, but there's something to be said about being able to read a series in its entirety in a timely fashion. So yay for that. We're going to take another break. When we come back, we'll be talking about spin-off, maybe. You'll just have to wait and see. You're tuned in to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back. Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my conversation with Evette Davis. Before the break, we were talking about books 2 and 3, and both of those books most likely coming out in 2025, which is awesome. Love it. Let's go ahead and return to the conversation with Evette.
I'm not going to write another book in this series, but I think there will be a spinoff to it where some of these characters go do something else. I think they're going to start a kind of a magical detective agency where they go looking for missing or stolen magic objects that are either, quite dangerous or can't fall into the, wrong hands. And so we'll see a little of that, but I don't have 20 books in me. And I sometimes, you get to that one and you're like, this could have ended at like 5 or 6 or whatever. So I don't want to, bash on my sisters, because I think anybody that writes a book, it's hard to write novels. And I do it after I've already worked a full 8-hour day running a company with another person. So it's just darn hard, and to even attempt it, and not be one of those people who's just on the couch going, yeah, I'm going to write a book. And they've been telling you that for like 10 years. So, but it's awfully fun.
Yeah.
It's awfully fun.
Again, off topic. Do you speak French?
Juste un peu. My whole family, my daughter is fluent in French and Arabic. She went to a lycée, and my husband is fluent in French and Spanish. And I was much more fluent in French when I wrote the books. And then, you kind of lose it. But if I was allowed to go back and live in France, I'm sure I'd pick it up in no time. Yes. And I could be in a room and listen to people or read a newspaper or listen to television. I would pick up a lot more than I'd be able to reply to you if you ask. Like, are you learning Portuguese? Because to me, that's an impenetrable language. I can only just say obrigado, obrigada, whichever, right?
Obrigada. Right. Yep. My vocab is great. Like I can spout off lots and lots of words. Putting them into sentences, much more difficult. And I live in a region that has a very distinct dialect that for me is hard to hear. So that's been a challenge, is trying to understand people, because like my reading comprehension is better than my listening comprehension. So
good for you for trying. I mean, I think that's amazing.
I took French in high school and college, and my 20 plus year French is sometimes better than, like, I can think of words in French before I can think of them in Portuguese, which is frustrating.
And that's why we made our daughter go to kindergarten and learned French, even though she probably hated us and was like, why are my parents so mean? But because that's the time to learn it, when your tongue and your ear don't war with each other on what they sound like. So
yeah, exactly. So what are you currently working on? Any projects for writing?
This is the first time in more than a decade that I don't have a book that I'm working on, and I'm actually kind of savoring not writing, and I'm reading like crazy. Like I'm reading Leah Bardo's The Familiar. I have Rachel Kushner's new book on my nightstand. So I'm plowing through a bunch of other books, and then I'm going to figure out what I want to do next. But it's been sort of a pleasure to not have to write. I do have some, like writing things like Q&As. Also, I'm going to probably take my novel 48 States, which I published on my own imprint, and I'm going to probably turn it into a serial on my Substack. So I have to work on that as well. But it's nice. I don't read other writers, a serious, writing while I'm writing, because I can't have both characters living in my head. It's like too much. It's like having a monster under your bed. You're like, shh, don't interfere with my flow.
When you do have time to read, just for you, what are your go-to authors?
Oh my gosh. I mean, so I'm a voracious news hound. I mean, I read, I'll start with the New York Times and I'll go through the Wall Street Journal. I read the Free Press, the Bulwark. I'll read, obviously the San Francisco Chronicle. I read all sorts of stuff. And I also read a lot of what my husband refers to as Chardonnay. Like I am a historical romance freak. I love Lisa Kelpis. I think that people underestimate how difficult it is to write a really good romance novel. It's really hard. And for the dialogue not to be cheesy or whatever. And of course, all these books always have very brave heroines who are like, want to be a doctor or a writer or so, but I love to read stuff like that. And then I read all the other fantasy writers that you love and other people love. I mean, I have a Libby app for my iPad and I have a Kindle Unlimited, and between them, man, I can load up. So I could read a menu if it was interesting. I read cookbooks. Like I fundamentally think that writers need to read just everything. You need to read. I like to read the dictionary occasionally. I think I just answered a question of like, what 5 books would I bring? I would definitely bring a dictionary with me if I got stranded on a desert island. You would never be bored. You'd be like, oh, I didn't know that. So, and I still keep one on my desk. I don't use an online dictionary because I think you can never put enough new words in your brain, as you're working. So.
I grew up with parents who, Mom, how do you spell this? Go look it up in the dictionary. Dang it.
Yeah. Yeah. But aren't you so glad? Aren't you so glad? It's like I asked my dad for a calculator and he made me learn my multiplication tables from 0 to 12 backwards and forwards before he'd let me have one. And you know what? To this day, I can still do it. So yeah. And you won't be able to do that if you use ChatGPT when you're in 5th grade. I'm here to tell you. So.
Yeah. The world is changing. It's interesting. I'm just going to go with interesting at this point because that's too much of a topic to cover here.
I know. Sorry, I took you down a rabbit hole.
No, it's good, but we could be here for days. So you maybe didn't set out to write. Did you come to the decision later in life, or how did you decide to write for publication?
So when I was little, I was a voracious reader and a writer. I wrote poetry and I wrote short stories and I was a newspaper journalist. That was my first job out of college. I studied creative writing and journalism. And I remember in college, my creative writing professors thought my work was too much like a news, paper article. And my newspaper editors thought my writing was too florid. And I graduated, I got a job at a newspaper and I worked at a newspaper in the Bay Area. I worked for a couple. And then my husband went to graduate school in Washington, D.C., and I could not get a job out there with any paper. So I started working on the Hill for a member of Congress as a press secretary. And then I did a little bit of work on a newsletter. Back then, pre-internet, you could work for a newsletter that people paid for that would give them information about legislation. And so I learned a lot about how the federal government worked. And then we came back to California. My husband was recruited to help found MarketWatch, the online news service. And I remember us talking about, you're going to get paid to put news on the internet. Are you sure this is real? Like, this could be like a scam. How will we know? Right. Ta-da. Yeah. And I started working in public relations because it was like 2 journalists will never be able to afford a house in the Bay Area. Somebody's going to have to get a real job and move on. And so I started working in public relations. I started in consumer public relations. Then I found public affairs, which sort of allows you to marry journalism and politics in a way that was satisfying. But I got part of the way in and I realized I missed writing. It was like I had removed a limb that was really profoundly connected to me. And so I started working on a novel, which is in a box. That first novel trope is true. And, I've been trying to fit writing in while being a mom. And then I gave it up for a few years while my dad had dementia and I had to take care of him. And now I'm kind of back at a place where I have a lot of time to devote to writing. And I think fundamentally, I hope everybody in their lives, whatever age they're at, has something that feeds their creativity. And for me, it's writing. It could be gardening. It could be cooking. But I think to be a fulfilled human being, you got to have something that makes your heart beat, that isn't tied to making money by the hour. It has to be you. And so for me, that writing is that thing. So I was early writer, left it, and then came back to it.
Love it. You just never know what that journey is going to look like, or where each step of those journeys is going to take you. So.
Yeah. And if you're lucky, you can have that adventure and nothing bad happens. I'm doing a podcast with a friend who I bought his PR from, and he's doing a podcast now on aging and, talking about just how many lives you can have in one life. How many acts can you fit in? And you know what? You can fit in plenty if you want to, but you have to not be afraid to change and to try. And I think that's fun.
Yeah.
To do that.
Absolutely.
It is time for our final break of this episode, but I think it's kind of fitting that we went into the last break after having had a conversation about instincts, trusting your gut, those sorts of things, and now we're going into this break talking about trying something new. Maybe following your instincts led you to something new. I don't know. There could be a connection there. Again, we can contemplate that as we go to break. When we come back, we'll be talking about advice, Evette's advice for aspiring authors. So you are tuned in to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back. Welcome back to the conclusion of my conversation with Evette Davis. Before the break, we were talking about trying something new, new beginnings, new experiences, etc., which is a really good segue into the advice question on the off chance that you are thinking of trying something new in 2025. So let's go back to that conversation.
From your own experience, then, what advice would you give to aspiring authors?
Well, where to start? One, I think go ahead and write, and without criticism of yourself, let yourself learn to write. I think writing is it's something that takes time. People are super impatient. You need to get better. The only way to get better is just to keep doing it. And then I think the most important advice is have a good editor. It's astonishing to me how many people don't think they need editors. I don't know where that came from. But it's crazy because everybody needs a good editor. And I have found one, and I had an editor, and I felt like they were not taking me where I needed to go. And I put the word out to all of my women writer friends and found another editor, Cassandra, who is in all of the dedications and acknowledgements of my books for forevermore. She just pulls the very hardest but best work out of me for my characters, for myself. And so I think you really do need a good editor. And if you can't afford it, then barter for it, trade or go belong to a writer's community. But you will never get better if your only sounding board is yourself. And I have beta readers, I have people who read the books early and can, ask quite like, why that? That doesn't work. I don't like that person. Maybe some of that advice you don't want, but you're never going to be a good writer by just admiring your own work. And that's hard because it's very painful when you get your first red line back and, you know, somebody sends you their feedback, and you have to be tough enough to take it, and you have to want to get better. And the difference for me, like looking at my first novel compared to my 6, you know, it's like when you lift weights. I mean, one day you can lift a lot of weight, right? Well, the same thing with your brain and your writing. So I would say practice and reading and even TV. Like, I don't know, it sounds like you might be a writer or have some background, but like I can watch television and recite the dialogue like a few lines into the movie or the TV, because it's all writing. So immerse yourself in art and music and writing, and you'll find that you'll be better as a writer for it.
Yeah.
But you got to start. And I think also you have to do it every day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Editors are kind of like your get a grip friend, because you know that one friend who's harsh, but
Yeah.
they speak the truth to you, hopefully in love, and you know you need that sometimes to.
That's right. You do. You need a mirror up to yourself sometimes of things that aren't working. And also sometimes you'll say to an editor, like, this isn't working and I don't know why, and they'll be able to tell you.
Yeah.
You know, so yeah, it's good to have a friend who'll give you the scoop, even if you don't want to hear it, right?
Because I imagine you're so immersed in your own work that it's hard to, you don't always see the bigger picture because you're so focused in on the details and where you want the story to go and how everything is progressing that you don't always see everything.
Yeah, I will just say, as I've grown older, you know, in my 20s, I was so afraid to make a mistake in anything. Now I'm a little older, I'm not as afraid of it. And I actually am okay. I can tell when I'm not doing my best work, when I'm not doing my best writing, when something hasn't put its best foot forward, and I'm okay with it now. And I appreciate people telling me. And I've had uncomfortable conversations in my professional life where someone's been unhappy, and I've said, this is unpleasant to hear, but like, if you don't tell me, then I won't be able to change. So, you know, I think it's good to be able to take feedback, but it is also a skill. You have to believe in yourself enough and the fact that you can overcome this or change it in order to take that criticism. But I do, you know, and there's ways of delivering criticism that are good, and there are ways that are not so good, right? So hopefully your messenger is a kind one.
Yeah, exactly. If people are interested in learning more about you and your books, you mentioned Instagram, but website and other social media that you're active on.
www.evettedavis.com, which going to my website is sort of the easiest, fastest way. Then you'll pick up all of my social media. You can subscribe to my Substack newsletter, which admittedly has been a little bit out of circulation lately because I've been finishing these 3 books, but I'm hoping to get back to that. I'm on Instagram. I'm on Facebook. I'm not really doing X or Blue Sky or any of that these days. I don't find it very conducive to my mental health. I'm sort of, you know, I enjoy getting notes and comments from readers. It's fun, but like those two form, I'm just sitting it out for a little while.
Yeah.
I wasn't a big Twitter person either, even though I know you're supposed to be, because it just, it's hard. And then I'm starting a street team, which again, you'll see notes about it on my Instagram for people who want to become early readers and reviewers. I'm going to start creating special gifts, you know, little things that no one else has. Maybe, you know, standalone chapters that no one else has read. So I'm going to come up with some fun things in 2025 to keep people engaged.
Thank you. Evette, we've talked about quite a few things, but is there anything that we haven't covered that you wanted to make sure people knew about the others or the Council Trilogy as a whole?
No, I mean, this was such a lovely interview. Thank you so much for the invitation. I really enjoyed the conversation. I mean, I guess I would just say that I really love hearing from my readers. I really love having these kinds of conversations. I think being a writer, one of the best parts is being able to exchange ideas and hear other people's stories. So other than supporting your public library, which would have been my pitch at the end, this has been marvelous. So thank you. I hope I'll have a chance to speak to you again one day.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate it. And thanks for taking the time out of your day. I know you're, with your family and on holidays. So thank you so much.
Happy New Year to you. Take care.
Thanks again to Evette for joining me to talk about the others, for introducing me to a new urban fantasy trilogy. I always love a good urban fantasy, so it's fun to find a new author and a new series that I can enjoy. If you are a fan of urban fantasy, you should definitely check this one out. And of course, the other 2 will be coming out sometime this year, so you have that to look forward to, being able to complete the trilogy within 2025, which is just crazy because we're only 4 days into 2025 right now. So I don't really want to think about completing 2025 just yet. It's going to come quickly. It's going to come quickly. So if you are a fan of really great, layered, somewhat complicated female characters, strong female characters in your urban fantasy, this one's got plenty. It's not just Olivia, but there's some other characters in here as well. If you are a fan of urban fantasy in general, as I said, you know, vampires, fairies, empaths, time walkers, those sorts of things converging into everyday life, and life in this case in San Francisco, then definitely check out this first book, which then of course we're going to end up in Europe for the second book, and that could be fun as well as we explore new places and new lore within the scope of urban fantasy. So thank you to Evette for joining me. Thank you, of course, as always, to you for joining me for this episode, for being patient as it was late this week. I hope that you will join me for my next interview, which I've actually already done today because this week's schedule has been a little bit screwy, but I spoke today, and that episode will go up hopefully on Tuesday. I spoke to returning guest Jody Hobbs-Hessler. When she was here before, we talked about a collection of short stories. This time we're talking about her newest novel. It's called Without You Here. I will give content warning. It does deal with some difficult subjects of death by suicide and mental health issues. So take that into account before tuning into that episode next week. But I do hope that you will join me. I always have a great time when Jody's on the podcast. We have good conversation and I enjoy speaking with her. So please join me on the next episode for that interview. In the meantime, if you're a fan of this podcast, and I hope you are, please do like, follow, subscribe on whatever platform you are watching or listening to this episode on. As a reminder, if you are listening to this episode, you can also watch these interviews. They are on YouTube, so if you want to see the authors I am speaking with, you can find the podcast on YouTube. It's fairly new, although we're coming up on almost a year. I think we started in April last year, so getting close to have been doing video episodes for a year. But please do follow and like, etc. Also, leaving a review really helps the algorithm. It's greatly appreciated. So if you can leave a positive review of the podcast, that would be amazing. Thank you so much in advance if you do that. Thank you so much in retrospect if you've already done that. You can follow the podcast on social media. You can find it on Facebook, X, Instagram, Blue Sky, and TikTok. See how long, hopefully you'll still be able to find it on TikTok in a few weeks, but we'll just see how that all plays out. But find the podcast on social media. Let me know what you're reading, how your 2025 is starting, what your reading goals are for the year, etc. Hope that you are having a great week and a great January and a great new year. Hope you had a fun and safe New Year's Eve. Whatever's going on in your life, though, as always, as we go into this new year, I hope the whole year gives you plenty of time to get yourself lost in as many good books as you can possibly stand up to. Thank you so much. I will talk to you next time.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet, damn, ain't that great. I don't wanna go to